May 14th, 2008. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was driving home after celebrating the end of his first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. The drive was routine, a short 30 miles. But for reasons unknown, Brandon took a different route. He began calling his friends, who he had just been partying with only a few miles away, although no one picked up. Not wanting to disturb them, but having no other choice, Brandon called his parents. At 1:54 a.m, a call was placed. His voice was steady, calm, but with a trace of annoyance. He wasn't hurt, his car wasn't damaged, just stuck. Outside, the roads were empty, no traffic, no passerby, just endless stretches of farmland and gravel roads, swallowed by the night. Brandon did his best to explain his surroundings, assuring his parents that he was uninjured and that the car remained intact. It was simply stuck. He just needed a ride home. But in the vast, featureless expanse of rural Minnesota, where the land stretched endlessly in every direction, there were no landmarks to guide him, no street signs, no buildings, only darkness and the faint glow of distant lights. Lights that, as the night went on, would become the most perplexing detail of all. Brian and Annette Swanson didn't hesitate. They got into their car, headed toward their son's location, barely 10 minutes from home. They expected to see his headlights flickering in the dark, maybe the outline of his car in a ditch, tilted at an angle. But as they approached the area he described, they saw no lights, no car, and no Brandon. Brian called him back. Something wasn't right. Brandon described his surroundings: open fields, a gravel road, a few fences, but no landmarks, nothing specific. His parents searched the area, flashing their headlights across the road, scanning the ditches, but there was no sign of him. Brandon assured them he could see the town in the distance, a warm, familiar glow cutting through the night. But as his father kept driving, those lights never got closer, and there was still no sign of Brandon. For 47 minutes, Brandon Swanson wandered through the darkness, describing everything he saw, except anything that made sense. He repeatedly assured his parents that he could see the distant glow of Lind, a small town just a few miles from Marshall, where he had started his drive. Confident he was heading in the right direction, he told his father they could meet there, where he could pick him up. He described passing through a field, feeling the uneven ground beneath his feet, then a fence. He climbed over it, kept moving forward. He reached a creek. The water was shallow but cold. He stepped through, his shoes sinking slightly into the mud before reaching the other side. Brian stayed on the phone, listening, reassuring him, keeping him talking. But then suddenly, Brandon's voice broke through the night. A sharp exclamation, a flash of panic. On the other end of the call, his father sat frozen, gripping the phone, listening to the emptiness where his son's voice had been just moments before. No rustling, no footsteps, no wind, just an unrelenting void. It was as if, in an instant, Brandon Swanson had simply ceased to exist. By sunrise, what began as a routine call for help had unravelled into something far more disturbing. Brandon's parents, growing desperate after hours of unanswered calls, contacted the authorities. But to their frustration, police initially dismissed their concerns. A 19-year-old going missing in the middle of the night. It wasn't unheard of. They assumed he had wandered off, maybe even slept somewhere, and would turn up later. But as the day stretched on and Brandon remained missing, the search became urgent. Authorities began by tracing his last known location, starting with the car he had abandoned on the side of the road. What they found didn't make sense. Brandon had insisted, repeatedly, that he was near Lind, a small town less than 10 minutes from his family's home in Marshall. He claimed he could see the lights of the town in the distance as he walked toward them, and yet his car was nowhere near Lind. Instead, it was discovered nearly 25 miles away, near the rural outskirts of Taunton, Minnesota. 25 miles. Somewhere between the moment Brandon ended the call and the moment his parents called the police, his known location had shifted by an impossible distance. This revelation changed everything. It meant that for nearly an hour, Brandon had been describing landmarks, fences, and roads that didn't match where he actually was. It meant that his parents, who had been searching frantically around Lind, had been looking in the completely wrong place. But most disturbingly, it meant that the distant glow of city lights, the ones Brandon had been so sure he was walking toward, shouldn't have been there at all. What had he seen? Even if he had mistaken a different town's lights for Lind, that still didn't explain how his descriptions aligned with a place he had never been that night. Nor did it explain, despite extensive ground searches, tracking dogs and aerial sweeps, no trace of Brandon was ever found, not a shoe print in the dirt, not a torn thread on a barbed wire fence. Nothing. As if, in those final moments before the call cut out, he had stepped into a place that didn't exist. In the years since Brandon Swanson's disappearance, numerous theories have emerged, some logical, others unsettling, yet none fully explain what happened that night. The most accepted theory is that Brandon fell into the Yellow Medicine River and drowned. Search dogs traced his scent to a nearby creek, suggesting he may have misjudged his footing in the dark. But if that's true, why was no body ever found? The river wasn't deep or fast-moving, yet extensive searches turned up nothing. No clothing, no phone, no remains. And if he had simply slipped, would his last words have been so sudden, so final? Some believe Brandon encountered someone in the darkness, but there were no signs of a struggle, no distress in his voice until the very end. If he was being followed, why didn't he say anything during the 47-minute call? Could Brandon have been unknowingly suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, or even a head injury? It might explain why he seemed so sure of his location despite being miles off course. But would confusion alone account for the eerie precision of his final words? And then there's the theory no one can explain. Brandon described landmarks that shouldn't have existed. He was convinced he saw the town of Lind, yet he was nowhere near it. As if somehow he had stepped into a place that didn't match reality. His final words were not of someone who tripped, not of someone simply lost. They were the words of someone who saw something we may never understand.